Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are this fine Friday. I'm Dale Willman of the Resilience Media Project at Columbia University's Earth Institute, and welcome to our Friday News Review. Each Friday, we're offering our look at some of the week's top environmental stories in conjunction with the Society of Environmental Journalists. Our goal is to elevate understanding of the week's most significant environmental stories and to discuss with reporters how they can offer coverage of these issues to their audiences. I'm happy to have with me today my friend Mark Schleifstein. Mark is an environmental reporter for the Times-Picayune and the New Orleans Advocate in Louisiana. More importantly, he's a multiple recipient of the Pulitzer Prize, something he would always prefer in a self-effacing way that I not mention. But there you go. 2 years before Hurricane Katrina hit his region, Mark and his partner wrote a series that predicted pretty much everything that would happen if a major storm like Katrina were to hit, and it turns out they were pretty much right. Unfortunately, their work was pretty much ignored by policymakers, so little was done beforehand that could have saved lives and property. And we'll maybe talk about that a little bit, Mark, when we get going. Today, we're going to talk about the start of the hurricane season and projections for this year's dead zone in the Gulf. And we're going to talk a bit about how local reporters can find entry points to cover those stories. But first, a quick look at stories in the news this week. And joining us for that is another friend, Joe Davis of the Society of Environmental Journalists. Joe is a journalist. He also compiles a daily feed of environmental news for SEJ. And if you're interested in that feed, you can head over to the website and sign up for it at sej.org. Joe, thanks for being here. So what stories stood out for you today?
Hi. Well, today, one of the most interesting was the fact that the, the Environmental Protection Agency proposed undoing a rule that the Trump EPA had done. And what the Trump EPA did was to nullify something that had been on the books for 50 years. Under the Clean Water Act, states could veto certain federal permits, and the Trump EPA made it so they couldn't. And now the Biden EPA is reversing the reversal and making it so the states get a veto again. Uh, that's kind of news. It's the latest in a long series of de-Trumping decisions that have been made at EPA.
And this is significant because of the
Well, there are a
what's the
lot of
qualifier? Relative ease, somewhat, that the fact that it's a rule and not a regulation. So
well,
it's at the whims of the president, right? That this could be changed in a sense, or tell me the background on that
it
element of
could
it.
be changed again. What a rule and a regulation are practically the same thing. This is a proposed rule, which means it has to go through public comment and some weighing before it gets to be a final rule. But the reason Trump could undo it was because it was a rule then too. That the permitting provision is actually in the Clean Water Act, which is federal law, which isn't going to be repealed anytime soon.
Okay, what's the next story you've got for us?
Uh, well, everybody's worried about something called PFAS. In the headlines, people will sometimes call it forever chemicals. It's really a family of several thousand chemicals. They all have a fluorine atom in there. So they're called perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances. The news is that they've shown up in the drinking water near four military bases, one in Washington State, one in Pennsylvania, one in Florida, and one in Michigan. Uh, there's no official maximum contaminant level but there's kind of an advisory one, and the concentrations found in those four states are above that EPA set limit. Uh, it's presumed that since these are all near military bases, that probably the military base is the source of it. Typically, it's used for the foam used to fight airplane fires.
And these have been in the news for other reasons as well. In fact, this also was in the feed uh, earlier, and the fact that these chemicals are showing up in fast food wrappers.
Yep.
But it's an issue across the country because they're called forever chemicals, right? That they don't
Yeah.
degrade, they don't break down, and they can be found
Although,
in many different things.
exactly. Although you could also call them everywhere chemicals. They're not all the same. Remember, there are thousands of them, and but some of them do have very serious health effects, such as cancer, uh, kidney and testicular cancer. They also cause liver damage. So you really don't want exposure to these. It's an emerging thing, and uh, only some states have set drinking water standards for this, and EPA hasn't really made it a mandatory drinking water standard yet.
I'm going to put you on the spot just a little bit, and you may
Okay.
not, and likely won't have an answer for this. But these are tough stories to report on. They're tough stories to get people's attention. Have you seen anything in your searching every day? Have you seen any stories that kind of stand out in the way they engage people on this? It's a critically important thing because of what these chemicals represent, but it's a hard thing, I think, to get people engaged. So, are there some ways that you think reporters might be able to tell this story in a way that gets people to pay
Well,
attention?
what I've noticed is that when it's your water, your whole audience cares about it. Uh, so typically, somebody finds a level or a reading of a PFAS chemical in some local drinking water source, and all of a sudden it's a big local story. And then everybody is outraged and they yell at the state, "Why haven't you done something about this?" And the state tries, but it's really something that might be better done started at the federal level. I don't know what reporters can do. They can keep an eye on the test results from their local drinking water system. That would be a good start.
That's what I'm wondering if they're required. They're only required to test for certain numbers of lead and a few other things,
Well,
depending on what has been found there before. So I don't know if they all test for this or not.
I don't. Okay, you did put me on the spot. The short answer is I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of drinking water utilities do test for these chemicals, and more every day. And now that some states are starting to regulate them, so if they do a test on the water, they have to make that public information. Uh, so if you ask your local drink, if you as a reporter ask your local drinking water utility what non-regulated pollutants they find in their water, they have to tell you.
Well, a lot of reporters have relationships. When I was teaching a course at Skidmore, I would take the students down to our water treatment plant every year, and they're pretty accessible and pretty open to
Oh,
generally to
sure.
offering that information. You
They
just have to ask for their water testing report. In fact, in many communities, it's sent out to the communities. Most people
yeah,
don't know how to read it or what they can find in it, but that information is pretty readily available.
I think
So
it's called the Consumer Confidence Report.
for water, EPA is in the midst of putting together a rule that will add it to the list of chemicals that drinking water systems have to report, and it will be uh, completed. The public um, uh, the public uh, addressing of this will be completed this fall.
Yeah, EPA is actually involved in a whole lot of initiatives on PFAS chemicals, and
Right.
they'll take some time.
Yeah.
All right, so you have one more story for us?
Uh, yeah, as soon as I figure out what it is. Um, sorry.
Well, while you're looking, I'll mention there's one
God.
other that I wanted to have a conversation about, and I couldn't get an expert to join us, and that's what OPEC Plus is doing with
Oh,
adding more
that may be
production.
more important than what I'm talking about, was going to talk about. It, the headline is you're not going to get any relief from high gas prices soon. Uh, OPEC met yesterday and actually decided that they would produce more oil, or they would raise their production faster than they originally expected to. And that's partly because the oil market is tight, and crude oil prices are very, very high. They haven't been this high for years. So it's like $120 a barrel now. Uh, anyway, the OPEC action isn't expected to really lower oil prices or gasoline prices much, if at all, because there are other factors at work, including the war in Ukraine. That's the short version.
Okay, and that's a tougher story for journalists to access, to find, other than, the uh, it's such an international element to it. So localizing that for your community is a little bit tougher, other than putting it in terms, I guess, of uh, prices at the pump,
Yeah,
uh,
and
increase of cost in consumer goods, that sort of thing.
So one
prices
one of the
are
ways
regional.
Oh, go ahead,
one of
Mark.
the ways for locals, if they're in communities that have refineries, is to check with the refineries and see if if they are online and operating. In Louisiana, we have several refineries that have either closed or are in the midst of major renovations for a variety of different reasons, which has been part of the problem nationwide with the flow of fuel. Also on the Gulf Coast, the other thing to check with is whether or not your community is near one of the places where oil and gas are stored by the federal government, where the Biden administration has been selling some of that oil on the market as well, which has very little effect, pennies at most on the cost of gasoline at the pump.
Well, the Republicans are eager to say that it's all Joe Biden's fault,
Yeah.
and they won't. They don't care much what I say, but it's useful to observe that oil prices are high all over the planet, not just in the United States.
And it's the other piece of this is that the oil and gas companies are making significant profits right now, and some states like California are going after those profits, even though the
Yeah,
federal government is not. So that's something to think about as well. EU has already tried to do that as well as part of their efforts to deal with Russian oil.
the bottom line is that there are very few things that the president can do that he has discretion over that would really change the price of gasoline much.
Right. And I think one of the things that is often talked about in these circumstances is domestic production and energy independence, and that we produce enough oil to meet all our needs, and then we won't have to worry about Russian oil or oil from anywhere else. And one of the elements of that is rarely mentioned is that capitalism means that oil can be sold all over. So a lot of domestic oil is actually sold to overseas markets. So even
Yeah,
if we were producing enough, we still wouldn't have enough to be able to do to cover our own energy needs.
not
Right.
only are we exporting oil, but I think we're one of the largest exporters in the world. We are now competitive with Russia and Saudi Arabia in terms of how much we export. So it's not about domestic oil supply, it's really something else. And the price of oil, while complicated, is very responsive to geopolitical instability, and that's what we've got right now.
Right. All right. Well, Joe, thank you for this roundup.
Okay.
Let's switch to Mark and talk about hurricanes.
Hey, thanks.
Joe, thanks so much. And
Yep.
Mark, so it's the start. This is really fascinating to me. We're at the start of the hurricane season, but the official start. We've already had a hurricane.
No, we have not. Well, yeah, we've had one
Off Mexico.
well, yeah, we've had one in the Pacific,
Right,
uh,
right.
not in the Atlantic Basin, which is the East Coast and um, the Gulf of Mexico. My area, and but we have the potential for one to be formed of at least a tropical storm over the next couple of days from a system that was that Pacific hurricane that crossed over. The remnants of it crossed over um, uh, Mexico and is in the midst of moving across the Gulf of Mexico towards the Florida Keys and the west coast of Florida today, and probably will be a pretty significant rainy event for them, for the lower Florida peninsula over the next couple of days. Yeah, hurricanes are a continuing concern and a growing concern because of the potential for climate change to affect their intensity, both in a variety of different ways. We in New Orleans have been seeing all of the effects of climate change on hurricanes hitting us over the last couple of years. Intensity, uh, um, there seems to be a potential for hurricanes to be more strong each year as a result, largely because of water temperatures underneath them, which act as their engines. Um, and that has resulted in us having back-to-back Category 4 hurricanes make landfall in Louisiana in 2000 and 2001 with significant major damage. Both of them basically windstorms, but also having storm surge. Storm surge is another issue that is climate related because sea level rise is occurring. That means that the storm surge along the Gulf Coast is also increasing. Along the Louisiana Gulf Coast, that's exacerbated by local subsidence, which is a significant part of our sea level rise problem here. So we have sinking land added to rising waters that results in higher storm surge levels when a storm comes ashore. We lucked out last year, quote unquote, with Hurricane Ida. It came in a way that it did not significantly challenge the levee system along around the city of New Orleans, the new levee system that was built after Hurricane Katrina or rebuilt in most of the areas. But areas outside that levee system between New Orleans and the coast were pretty devastated by 12 to 15 feet of water that came in as storm surge. And so that's a real problem. The other issue that we're seeing directly related to climate is also related to temperature, and that is causing many of these storms to have more rainfall. Again, in part because, for instance, when Ida crossed the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf was warmer than usual and was adding more moisture into the air that the hurricane could take with it, and that moisture also was flowing in the path of the hurricane, so that even as that hurricane weakened as it moved ashore and moved across the United States to New Jersey and New York, it had a huge amount of rain attached to it, which caused significant problems in areas that were not expecting heavy rainfall of that type to occur, and caused lots of deaths far away from where it made landfall in
Well,
Louisiana.
like my neighborhood in upstate New York, we weren't expecting rain. There was massive flooding, 26 deaths in Louisiana, I think, and 50 in the Northeast
Right.
from the residuals effects.
And most of those in the Northeast were people caught in basements. In Louisiana, that doesn't happen because there are no basements,
But
which
it's a
is
justice issue here. It was a justice issue in New York because the basement apartments are those that most people don't want. So it's mostly people on the lower economic strata that live in those places. So a lot of the deaths were of people who didn't have a lot of options
right.
of places to go and ways to get away. So these are always layered and contextual issues. As environmental journalists like to say, that environmental stories don't break, they ooze, but they're also complex. And it's that complexity that makes these interesting, but sometimes more difficult to report on. So last year, third most active hurricane season ever. I think that's right. It was the
Yeah.
second straight
Right.
year that they ran out of names and had to start over again with 21
Correct.
named storms.
Right. Of
Um,
course, the most active season was in 2005, which included Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Wilma, two of the most intense hurricanes, at least at some point during their formation and movement. Really significant storms, and uh, one of the issues about climate change that is still unanswered is, um, will there be is climate causing more hurricanes to occur? And at the moment, there is not proof that it is. What is happening is that there's a another long-term climatic process that is occurring called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation, which adds more warm water in the Atlantic Ocean that increases the number of hurricanes during a 25 to 40 year period. The last cycle began literally in 1995, as if somebody had flipped a switch. And we are still in that cycle now. And people are concerned, is it going to end? That really is the question, and that's unclear. The other thing that is unclear whether or not there's a climate effect is the El Nino La Nina cycle, which is in water temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. We have a more active season this year because we're in the midst of a La Nina cycle where you have warmer water at the Eastern Pacific near the equator off of Mexico. What that does in the Atlantic is that it actually reduces the wind shear that occurs in the Atlantic basin where hurricanes form, and it's wind shear that chops up the thunderstorms that create hurricanes. So when you have less wind shear, you have more chance for those thunderstorms to gather together. And that's the other thing we're facing right now. That plus higher sea surface temperatures throughout the basin. Part of the climate change effect, though, is that the area where hurricanes can form seems to be moving north a bit, expanding north in the Atlantic. And again, that's because of sea surface temperatures are increasing in that area. So that's a problem for areas in the Northeast where there's a better chance that hurricanes can move into northeastern locations without de-intensifying, without reducing their intensity. An example of that would be Hurricane Sandy, which wasn't really a hurricane by the time it hit New York anymore, but its intensity was such that it certainly brought all the effects of a hurricane to the region, including storm surge that was rather significant.
and a great deal of flooding up here then from Sandy as well.
Right.
So further north, I mean, not in New York City, where of course it was devastating. So the reason I mentioned, excuse me, the statistics about 2021 and 2020 with 30 storms in that year as well, is that we see this increasing number and intensity. You had talked about what's expected from climate change, the warmer waters, the air that can hold more water, and all of these increasing that. So the expectation is that we'll continue to see some amount of growth in both numbers or at least sustaining in numbers and intensity as we move forward. Ida was $60 billion of damage. $60 billion of damage from one storm. It was one of the 5 costliest storms since 1980. And there were 4 storms last year that were at least $1 billion in costs. So there are many reasons to be covering the story.
Right. And remember that one of the reasons for this is because people like living on the beach. Literally, 50% of the United States lives on the coast in coastal counties. So that's a significant issue as well, which may change over the next couple of decades because of climate change, because of sea level rise, and the fact that some of these communities are going to be seeing more and more of these kinds of events, or just literally high tides causing flooding, which is what's happening right now in Miami Beach, where you've got high tides occurring much more often that are flooding streets than they have in the past. So that's another problem. The other piece of that is, of course, that as we saw during, in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Congress was very friendly with its largesse, made a hell of a lot of money available. Our new levee system cost $14.5 billion when you add all the other bells and whistles that were added to it in terms of pumps and interior drainage stuff. And part of what happened after Katrina was that the Army Corps of Engineers was required to monitor all federally funded levees throughout the United States and give them a rating, and require the local sponsors of those levees to meet the requirements of their of the Corps of Engineers or lose flood insurance. And that is something that is continuing today. So you're seeing quite a few more communities asking for more money from Congress through bills like the Water Resources Development Act, which is going through the House on Tuesday, I think. So those are other issues that are popping up as part of this whole process.
That's a good entry point for journalists then, to look at that legislation to see what communities are a part of that.
Absolutely, and other communities are looking at ways in the aftermath of Katrina to do what New Orleans did: build large barrier structures or find wetlands restoration, natural resource processes to reduce storm surge damage along the coast. And those issues also are being addressed in this WRDA and in other bills that are going through Congress, including in the infrastructure bills that were passed last year.
So a question on the screen now from Alan Schaefer about the Army Corps' post-Katrina work, which you're talking about here. Wants to know if it's proven to be effective in boosting resilience of the New Orleans region to subsequent storm events.
Okay, well, this is where I and some of the experts that in the city officials come to a difference of opinion. And it is, I will say this, the levee system that has been rebuilt around the city after Katrina is the best hurricane storm surge levee risk reduction system in the world. There's no question about that. It's going to reduce damages over time significantly. However, it's not enough, and the Corps of Engineers recognizes that by actually giving the levee system a rating. If you look at the Corps' levee dashboard, and if you just do a search on Corps levee dashboard, the dashboard will show up, and you can pull up individual levee systems in that dashboard. If you look for the two New Orleans pieces of the levee system, West Bank and vicinity and Lake Pontchartrain and vicinity, they are both rated as high risk to moderate risk by the Corps in its new risk rating system. That's the second and third worst rating in the system. It's a 1 to 5 system, and the New Orleans gets a 4 and a 3. And the reason for that is because the levees will be overtopped by storm surge from a hurricane that is above a so-called 100-year level, a 1% chance of occurring in any year. And the damage that is going to happen in the city of New Orleans could be as much as $200 billion from that storm. That's a significant event, and the Corps recognizes that in its rating system. But the damage will be much less than if the levees had not been rebuilt. The city would have had to have moved if that had not happened. So that's one of the issues that a lot of communities are facing now. And other communities, they look at this and they see this whole fight going on in New Orleans. There's actually a provision in the bill being considered on Tuesday that would give the Corps the ability, basically telling it needs to look at the chance of improving the system to a 200-year level of risk reduction, which would be a significant increase in risk reduction. It might mean a 5 to 6 foot increase in the size of the levees that are there now, or a significant increase in the amount of wetlands restoration on the outside of the levee system, reduce surge. Those are the kinds of things that communities that don't have levee systems are looking at and going, well, how come they're not doing that here? Miami is a good example of that. In Houston, there's a $29 billion Corps project underway to give them a barrier across the Galveston River, going, into Houston. So those are things that are being looked at. New York City is also looking at a surge barrier process at the moment without much success. And meanwhile, you still got houses falling into the ocean in parts of North Carolina from storm surge, just from regular storms, not even from hurricanes. So,
well, and that's also that is a good entry point for journalists in this. Hurricane Sandy, huge push after that for all sorts of things. I forget what it was called, the Big U. There was an effort in New York. They were going to have this whole protection, especially along the southern part of Manhattan, and they were going to put in, a levee at one point and some green space in places that would act as buffers. And it was a massive plan that was put forth, and it's quietly just sort of, we just don't talk about that anymore because the cost is just outrageous. I mean, it's expensive to protect.
Right, it's significant, and you can look at what happened after Katrina with the state and its funding as a good example of that. Under the Corps rules, the local sponsor is required to pay 35% of the cost of those levee systems. After Katrina, the state entered an agreement with the Corps of Engineers to expand the time frame for repaying that to 30 years, with the payments to begin when the levee system was completed, But the Corps would charge the state interest until those payments began and include that in the cost. Well, that added $1.5 billion of cost to the state of Louisiana because the levee system was completed officially last week. Last
Hmm.
week, 12 years afterwards. So the Corps had to, I mean, the state had to go back to Congress to get Congress to agree to allow them to pay off that 30-year debt, the 30-year time frame, reduce it to 2 years to get rid of the interest charges. And the state has now done that and paid $400 million last year and is paying the rest of it this year. But that's a significant expense. And all of these other levy systems are also being required to do that. And the reason communities want to do that, though, is because if they don't do it, the levy system will not be certified because it won't meet that 100-year level of protection that's required by the National Flood Insurance Program. And then the flood insurance of individuals in those areas could be canceled. And that's a significant loss for individuals that many communities are well aware of.
And I don't want to, I'll point at the obvious. We're two white guys sitting and talking about this issue.
Yep.
There are environmental justice issues involved in this. In the case of Sandy in New York, a lot of the focus now is on protecting the Wall Street area, the Southern Manhattan area, where all the money is. The Red Hooks, the other communities over in Brooklyn, with people of color, with a lower economic status there. Those places aren't really in the conversation anymore in a lot of ways on this big plan that was going to be put in place. So that's being scaled down to protect economic interests and not those people who are often most at risk of these storms.
That's true, and the Biden administration has been attempting to address that through some of their proclamations where they are insisting that the Corps and other agencies address the concerns of low income and people of color in dealing with all federal projects. But it again, on a case by case basis, it is very slow to happen. We saw that after Katrina with the reconstruction program in New Orleans, what I call basically ad hoc discrimination. It wasn't planned by the community that they would discriminate against low-income residents, but in the rush to get as many things rebuilt as quickly as possible, the focus was placed on those locations where there already was money available, largely in the context of individuals who were moderate income residents who had the money invested in their homes that they were able to turn into rebuilding those houses. And the result of that was that those areas where the homes were not worth much as those moderate income areas were the last areas to be addressed with grants and loans, and the last areas that have come back. And it's been a real problem. The result of that, I think, has been a greater emphasis in the years afterwards to address this problem, but it still hasn't worked yet.
A quick aside: when you mentioned the levee system, the site on the Army Corps of Engineers, I don't know if this is a foreshadowing event or what, but I've tried loading it to bring up on the screen, and I just keep getting an intercept saying, can't reach this page.
Oh, okay.
So that might be a bad sign. I want to get to dead zones because that's important in the news this week, but one other quick thing is the idea of the concept of expanding Bullseye. So some scientists are talking about this, disaster planners are talking about this, but it's not, I don't think, in the public lexicon yet. And that's the idea that risk is hazard times exposure. If there's no exposure, that hazard provides less risk when you're at least speaking in human terms. And what we're doing is we're expanding that bullseye that's the target for that hazard because we're infilling, we're building, Houston covered how many wetlands and put houses in those former wetlands that you were talking about as a way of helping to absorb storm surge. I mean, wetlands are amazing features capable of taking in a lot of water that can reduce the risk that is available there, and yet we're filling those in, we're putting homes in there, and then we're surprised when they get flooded when these events happen. So it's a different way of looking at these stories as an entry point for journalists to think about what policies have been put in place that put more people at risk. That's increasing the exposure to these hazards in a way that if we plan differently, wouldn't happen. You see it with the wildfires out west as well.
Yeah. One of the issues that the National Hurricane Center is now facing is that their predictions for hurricane landfall have become so accurate that they've reduced that bubble that they put in for their, it shows the percent chance that the storm will occur somewhere within that bubble in where they show the path of the storm going ashore. Well, that bubble is narrowed so much that they are having to put out more clear explanation that the effects of the storm will definitely be outside that bubble, especially the rainfall and in many cases the storm surge will occur outside that predictive path. And in fact, they now have separate storm surge messaging, where they give, everybody focuses on National Hurricane Center's forecast, and that forecast is that bubble path, but there's a separate forecast that they put out now that is just for storm surge, that includes a long line along the coast that says your percent chance of storm surge occurring in this area is, whatever it is, which is equally important. So they're recognizing that risk as well. And that all gets back to this question of, we have so many people who are moving into our coastline counties, and they're becoming more and more at risk as a result of that.
Do they, in those graphics that they present for that, are they still using Sharpies?
No.
So before we've got maybe 15 minutes for dead zones, but just quickly, do you have any other thoughts? We've sort of randomly talked about some entry points that journalists can use to look at these things. So it's, what planning is underway in your community. I like the idea of the expanding bullseye, what your community is doing with its planning function that may increase or reduce risk, because that's often not factored in city planning. They don't think about those sorts of longer time frame issues. Are there other entry points that you can think of that would be good for reporters who haven't come to this issue before to help them cover it?
There's a big one this year, and that is COVID.
Of course.
Because COVID restrictions have reduced dramatically, most areas have changed the way they're going to be doing evacuations. In our area, a lot of the evacuations last year were hotels were named and said, you can go here, and we are paying for the space at these hotels. Well, those hotels are now all booked up because there are no COVID restrictions, so they can't do that anymore. So they're going back to open shelters, and you should expect that there will be some COVID restrictions in those shelters as well. And that would be a good story. The other issues that are quickie stories that people can do is just what are the efforts being made in your location to deal with pets? In Louisiana, there are actually ways of putting pets on trucks where they'll be taken to their own shelters, because pets were a key reason people stayed behind.
Right.
And then, of course, more importantly, those people who don't have transportation, what are the ways to get them out? In most communities, that's not really a problem. you get a bus and you go a couple of miles inland to a shelter. In Louisiana, in some parts of Texas, you're going to have to move well inland to get away from the effects, and that results in some early planning that you have to do well in advance of any individual storm and be ready for that to do. And then, the other obvious thing is just make sure you've got everything you need to know, including, most importantly, making sure that you're properly insured and that you have an ability to get in touch with residents, your family members in the aftermath of a storm. Make sure that you've got some phone outside the state that you're in that might have access to phone service that you can call and say, hey, I'm okay.
It's when you mentioned the COVID too, that reminded me of work that Jeff Schlegelmilch and some other folks at Columbia are doing on compound risk. As human beings and as reporters, which is a subset, of course, of that human being world, but we tend to focus on one thing, and it's a simplification that makes our work easier, better to do in some ways. But the world doesn't function that way. The world functions often in compound risks. Out west, it might be a massive wildfire that's combined with a massive drought that together create even greater risk. And the same thing happened with COVID, because when hurricane season started around Florida, they typically end in New Orleans, of course. They send people to shelters. You can't do that because of COVID, so where do they go? In the meantime, there's a massive heat wave going on, so we need electricity to have air conditioning to keep people cool. So all these risks laid on top of each other create these compound risks that can be much more damaging than any one event that's occurring. And so that's something that I think journalists can look at as well, is the idea of compound risk and how that might affect your community when something such as a hurricane or a wildfire, whatever it might be, is occurring.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, especially with electricity, the thing to look at there is that there will be a major overlap between state and local communities' efforts to improve transmission systems to deal with storms and wildfires with climate change and the needs that will be required to deal with electric vehicles, and how that is going to completely change our transmission system nationwide. Those things are underway now, and it should be reporters' jobs to make sure that both the risk issues and the climate change issues are addressed at exactly the same time, that they aren't ignored.
All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left. So let's talk about dead zones, hypoxic areas. And that's a huge problem, obviously, off the coast of Louisiana and Texas. So there's been a projection this year. There's an annual projection of how big they think it's going to be, and what's the verdict?
Okay, so I just popped up what the estimate is. This time of year, this is becoming an annual thing. There have been there's a couple of scientists in Louisiana at LSU and Louisiana University's Marine Consortium that have been doing boat trips along the coast for 35 years with divers going down and taking measurements of how much oxygen there is in the water. And the issue here is hypoxia, which is levels of oxygen below 2 parts per million, which is enough to kill things that live on the bottom, benthos, and to cause fish to swim away and other organisms to avoid the areas. And it's a significant amount. So every year, U.S. Geological Survey does a survey of nutrients that are in the Mississippi River at different locations in Louisiana. And scientists from all over the country, and actually now in Canada, put together estimates of what they think this big dead zone will be for at the time that survey is made, which is the last week of July. And this year, they have concluded that it's going to be an area as big as the state of, come on, Mark.
Connecticut.
Connecticut, thank you.
Yeah.
A mental block there. State of Connecticut, or and that's a significant amount of water, and it's a problem. It's been there forever, and it's been directly linked to the two fertilizers that are key problems, and are most used by Midwest agriculture, and that is nitrogen and phosphorus. But it's mostly nitrogen that's causing these dead zones. Phosphorus is more likely linked to eutrophication in freshwater areas. And what happens is that you get this water with this huge amount of nitrogen in it that floats out of the Gulf, out of the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya River, which takes 30% of the flow of the Mississippi and puts it into the Gulf as well. And it creates a layer over the salt water of the Gulf of Mexico. And algae blooms occur in that layer, and they grow rapidly in the spring and summer months. They die, they sink to the bottom, they're eaten up, and that results in the loss of all the oxygen at the bottom. And that doesn't switch back until you get a hurricane or some other major storms. And that doesn't happen until usually later in the hurricane season. So that's a real problem. The issue is significant for Louisiana fishermen, because they have to travel farther to get shrimp and fish that are their livelihoods. But it could have significant effects, because it's been happening now for more than 70 years, on our water bottoms in this area. And we just, there's not enough research that's been done to identify what those long-term losses. The other problem is that what basically has developed is a voluntary effort to reduce emissions upstream. And while those efforts for, say, sewage treatment plants in urban areas are pretty much underway because of permitting requirements, non-point source pollution doesn't have that kind of permitting requirements. And EPA has not put limits on what can go off of farmland into any of these little streams and that enter into the Mississippi watershed and then end up in the Mississippi River and go down to the Gulf. So there have been millions of dollars that's been spent on different efforts to put all sorts of new wetlands or green strips around farmland, but they've had absolutely no effect. The last 20 years, the NOAA report that announced this yesterday said that this is an average year for the dead zone. It's going to be another average year. Well, it's been an average year for 20 years. And there's a task force of states and federal officials that have come up with a plan, quote unquote, to reduce the size of the dead zone by 25 from its present size of about 5,000 square miles to no more than 1,900 square miles by 2035. But the reality is that nothing's happened. It's not happening. There's an interim goal of a 20% reduction by 2025, and nothing's happened on that as well. Now, EPA has said this year that it's taking $60 million of money from the infrastructure bill from last year and using it for projects. What those projects are, nobody knows because people have to apply for them, and that process is just beginning. And EPA has successfully battled efforts by environmental groups, especially in Louisiana, to reduce emissions by regulation up the river over the last 20 years. So it's a real problem, and it's not going away anytime soon.
I have a friend who's ecological economics professor in Vermont, and he does this great presentation on changing baselines. And what he does is he uses photos from a marina in Florida where people come in after they've been out fishing and they all stand there smiling with their trophies. And he starts back in the 50s, and people have these huge, tuna or whatever, I don't know what the fish are down there that they're getting, but a big fish, the six
Tuna.
big fish. It's a bonefish, tuna, whatever it is. And then by the 60s, they might have a couple of those and some smaller ones like this. And by the 70s, there's no big ones, but those medium-sized ones. And by the 80s, they've got like 30, but they're all this big.
Yeah.
So as time passes, the baseline of what's normal changes. And I say this because my understanding, at least, is that these massive dead zones didn't start occurring really till the 70s. So
No. Well, some of them didn't, but this one's been there for quite a while. I mean, it really
of this size.
It occurred when the revolution occurred in agriculture in the Midwest. So
Well, the Green Revolution really kicked into the 60s.
yeah.
So around then is when it started. So back then, if you had said there's going to be a dead zone the size of the state of Connecticut off the coast, people would be shocked, stunned, alarmed. Now it's just sort of, yeah, well, this is average. So the baseline has shifted from an expectation of a clean Gulf to an expectation of, well, this is kind of the norm.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry, I'm going to disagree with you then, because you have
Please.
to remember the other environmental loads in the Mississippi River at that time were dramatically significant, and so nutrients were just a tiny problem. They've actually cleaned up a hell of a lot of the other pollutants that were in the river. There are new pollutants that are there that nobody's really talking about yet, but those things really in the 60s and 70s would have overwhelmed this whole question. It really was when in 85, when this study process began, that people finally woke up and said, there's a problem here. We really need to start doing something about it. The federal government and the states have been doing that. They've had this federal state task force up and running since 2001. And they set goals, and they spend a hell of a lot of money, and nothing changes. And now you've got the problems of climate change that have increased the amount of nutrients that are entering the Gulf. That whatever the good has been happening because of all this money that's been spent upriver is sort of overwhelmed by the climate change and the increased amount of rainfall that's occurred in the Midwest. That's really changed things, and that's a significant part of the problem that is not going away. So yeah, it's a very complicated issue.
Of course, but now you go ahead. Sorry.
Is where do you how do you measure this? Is it can we measure this through loss of fisheries that we're seeing? Well, there's other things that are causing loss of fisheries, including hurricanes, and numerous other things that have really destroyed the commercial fisheries in Louisiana over the last 20 years. That it's hard to capture this one signal and say, oh, gee, well, this is having this kind of a problem. Part of the issue here is going to be as the state deals with the effects of climate change, reducing the amount of wetlands around the levee system that's protecting New Orleans and other locations. Part of the process there is building new wetlands south of the city that's freshening that water, that's reducing all of those commercial fisheries that commercial fishermen are interested in. So that's another thing that sort of screws up. Gee, where is the problem here? Why are we still seeing this problem?
Well, I'm expecting an email from you in the next week or so, because I know you, and now you're going to go back and try and find out when those dead zones really started happening, because I'm curious when that happens. But the point of raising the changing baseline in my mind is I think as reporters we need to really be aware of that, because that affects what we see as stories and how we cover them too. So to be able to step back, and those changing baselines, as John talked about with the fisheries, that started in the 60s when the fish were huge. 50, 60 years ago, maybe a long scale for people like us, but for the human condition, for a society, that's a kind of short time period to have that level of change occur. So to think about how we change our expectations and our perceptions and what norm might have been earlier, I think is an important check for reporters as we cover stories to think about. And that's the point of raising that in that fashion. I think that's a significant thing anytime we do our story, to think about what conditions were like before. And I don't mean, 2,000 years ago, but even 50 years ago, and how that's changed and how it changes how we view those problems. Is it a long-term problem that's just going to continually exist, or is it something that 50 years ago we managed quite well? Yeah, so just a different way of looking at these stories.
So Louisiana had one of those wake-up moments in 1947, and that was when areas out west came up with this great plan to build a pipeline from the Mississippi River to help Texas. Okay, to reduce to increase farmland in Texas, and a guy in Louisiana said, "Well, gee, we need to start thinking about what effect that would have on South Louisiana," and he ended up basically doing a study that showed that if you the amount of water that they were talking about moving west to Texas from the Mississippi River would have destroyed the wetlands in South Louisiana, and that's still a problem today. And the result of that is significant changes that are occurring, including the coastal restoration program that the state of Louisiana has underway, that it's now spending $1 billion a year on building new wetlands.
All right, a good way to end today. Mark, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us for this. My thanks to all of you who've been watching us today and for joining us, and my thanks to our guests, Mark Schleifstein, the Times-Picayune and New Orleans Advocate, and Joe Davis of the Society of Environmental Journalists. Please add us to Fridays on your calendar and join us again next week. Until then, I hope you have the best of weekends. So long, everybody.
Thank you.